So I don't have any slides, so I will talk to you. So for those of you who don't know me, I'm Richard van Noorden. I've been a journalist at Nature for about 6 years and a news editor at Nature for the last year. So I'm a bit of an interloper here. I'm not directly involved in publishing manuscripts. Also, while I'm aware of Springer Nature's policies, I won't be able to give you an official answer if you have a question. So you should ask people like Grace Baines and others in the audience from Nature Springer about that. But from the science journalist point of view, from someone who covers research and mistakes and fraud, there's of course rising awareness of the problems of plagiarism, fraud, misconduct, but in my opinion, as other people have said, this is really a welcome trend. We're detecting more of this, journals are more willing to step in, retractions have risen, but to 0.02% of research papers clearly undercounts the self-stated fraud out there. Chris mentioned that there's a meta-survey in 2009 where scientists report themselves that they've fabricated, falsified, or modified data or results at least once in 1 to 2% of cases. So this is what scientists themselves are owning up to. And we see only 0.02% retractions and about 0.7 to 0.8% of papers corrections. So, you know, it's the tip of the iceberg, but more of it's uncovered. And I certainly don't believe there was a golden time before the millennium when only 30 papers a year, deserved to be retracted. I'm sure there was a lot going on in older papers that won't ever be corrected or retracted. But I think that a lot of journalists and people who sort of look at this are now coming to realize that sloppiness in research is really the major problem, and Catriona sort of talked about that. People essentially not being open with how they've done research, not being detailed in their protocols, and not doing standard statistical tests, randomizing animals to different groups in trials, all sorts of problems in the way that people design their research, which then leads it to be sloppy, possibly not correct. And I think that that's the major problem. So how do journals step in here? Because as Peter said, journals are not the police. If a badly designed study comes to a journal but it's kind of okay, what do? Do you just reject it? Well, no. So here's where I want to talk about what I think journals can do before publication to ensure that research is as well designed and reproducible as possible. Well, undoubtedly, institutions and funders have a massive obligation to train scientists to do better, and we are talking about 4 legs of a stool. But some journals have started to institute checklists to ensure best practice in research, and Catriona talked about that. And PLOS, as Catriona said, have said that all data must be open, and that means available for download somewhere in a public repository. The problem is that these checklists are guidance documents. They're not enforced. And we only find out that they're not enforced when people do research articles and look at lots of individual papers to see if they've been improved as a result of guidelines coming in. There was one paper in 2014 in PLOS Biology that looked at the ARRIVE guidelines in animal research. It found no difference before the ARRIVE guidelines were endorsed by Nature and PLOS and after they were endorsed by Nature and PLOS in some key aspects of quality reporting and research. So what was happening? Hundreds of journals have endorsed these guidelines, but not much is changing. Perhaps there's a very slow percolation. And I'm not saying that journals need to sort of say, you haven't ticked the "we randomize the animals" box, or you haven't ticked the conflict of interest box, but they do need to make scientists become explicit about the choices they've made in their design of their project. So if a scientist hasn't chosen a particular statistical test that seemed to be normal, they better have a good excuse for that. They better be told in the paper, we see you haven't ticked our box on our checklist, we'll need you to provide a statement why. We'll publish your paper, we think it's worth publishing. But we want you to be open about why you haven't adhered to the agreed standards for this kind of research. We're not going to be a policeman and reject your research. It's up to you if you want to do sloppy research or if you haven't crossed all the T's and dotted all the I's because you want to get the research out. But as a journal, that sort of provides you with a sort of way to publish the research, not put too much friction in the process, but make sure that you're a player advising scientists of best practice and making sure they're open about that. So in terms of other checks and balances, it does seem that many journals don't have people looking at images for accepted papers. Nature doesn't have someone looking at images for every accepted paper, and they pay dearly for that in the stap cell tragedy. And I believe that they look at papers occasionally or regularly. I think it's 2 in every issue or something like that. Clearly, they should have someone checking every accepted paper. They're a very high-profile journal. And we might talk about the burden that this puts on journals to do that, and maybe Bernd can talk about how much of a burden it is to employ someone to check images and papers, much as everybody regularly checks with plagiarism. So if I was to come to my sort of what I think sort of journals could do, given that you can't necessarily be policemen, number 1 would be enforce the policies. That there's lots of words like scientists should, we encourage scientists to, scientists ought to. Well, you know, where's the mandate here? Or what about saying, okay, if you don't want to, you don't want to, but we're going to make sure you explain why you didn't choose to do that. Number 2, evaluation. Not many journals evaluate each year how many corrections and retractions did they publish, how many cases did they consider. A journal signed up to some guidelines. 3 years later, what's happened? Has there been an improvement or no improvement? What about commissioning some research into looking at your own journal or family of journals? And in fact, the paper I quoted was a sort of PLOS biology paper, and it's those kinds of meta-research papers that actually show that the guidelines that are being brought in are not being very well enforced. And it's only at those points that we discover that this journey towards a more reproducible literature is very slow. So I'm not sure that journals can't fix data stewardship issues on their own. Institutions have a role to play, funders have a role to play, but they can be sure to make much more explicit the choices that scientists make in their research. In terms of retractions and high-impact journals, I think that poor standards of reporting of research can't be defended if it's true that high-impact journals have worse standards of reporting in their research. I'm surprised, but I'm willing to look at the papers and see that, but that can't be defended. Retractions, I think people who sort of say, well, you know, high-impact journals are less reliable. Well, you know, let's face it, they're publishing research that's out there. It's busting paradigms. It's not safe research. There's often not a protocol established for how to do it. So we should just accept and expect more retractions in high-impact journals. And if that paradigm-busting research was published elsewhere, we would expect more retractions among those journals. It's like startup companies. Some are going to fail. So I think what I want to sort of close with then is transparency and evaluation of the reports and guidelines that you sign up to. Because it's very easy to say that you're doing something when what you're doing is signing a bit of paper telling scientists to take steps, but you're not checking whether they've done so, or at least telling them to make clear whether they've done so, and you're not evaluating the results of what you've done. So it's easy for me to say all this because I'm not a publisher, I'm not a journal editor, I'm a journalist, but these are some of the frustrations that journalists see in research. How can this have been published without a COI? How could the scientists not have done that test? And okay, they didn't want to, but how come they don't even have to say that they didn't do it? This is what's annoying for journalists. And as Katrina said, science journalists, there's lots of bad journalism as well. There was a study from the University of Cardiff looking into why bad science journalism happens, that exaggerates the results of studies. It doesn't exonerate journalists to say that what the study found was that in many cases the exaggeration happened as a result of the press release. Of course, journalists who just follow the press release blindly are no more than scribes for the press release, so that's bad as well. So there's problems all down the chain. But journals thinking about how they promote their research, being careful to make sure that their press release doesn't overstate the research itself is also an important issue. So I'll end it there.